The first thing the world saw was a glow, a soft blue shimmer rising over Reactor 4, as if the night sky itself had been torn open. The second thing they saw was denial. Soviet officials whispered that it was contained, manageable, a local event. But nothing about Chernobyl was local, and nothing about it was manageable. If you're watching this, subscribe, because what you about to hear is the version of Chernobyl that was buried under propaganda and bankruptcy filings. For decades, we were taught the story in pieces: radiation, evacuation, the exclusion zone swallowed by forests and time. But the real story, the one the Kremlin feared most, wasn't radioactive. It was financial. It was a bill so large, so sudden, and so impossible to pay that it cracked the foundation of a superpower already standing on borrowed rubles. Imagine an empire already drowning in falling oil prices, shrinking revenues, and runaway military spending. Then imagine waking up to a disaster so expensive it could drain an entire year's budget in a single flash of light. That was the morning of April 26, 1986, the day the Soviet Union quietly went insolvent. Before Chernobyl, Moscow's economic problems were real, but survivable. The ruble was weakening. Productivity was stagnant. The state was juggling too many promises and too few resources. But nothing, not even the Afghan war, not even the global oil crash, compared to the financial black hole that opened when Reactor 4 exploded. It wasn't just an engineering failure. It was the detonation of the Soviet balance sheet. The numbers alone tell a story of panic. $18 billion, in a currency system where billion was a word used only in whispered party meetings. A cleanup operation so huge it consumed the budgets of multiple ministries. A sarcophagus built in record time, swallowing raw materials and manpower that the economy simply did not have. 300,000 people relocated, which meant 300,000 workers removed from the Soviet labor force overnight. And while the rest of the world measured the fallout in sieverts, Moscow measured it in deficits. Gorbachev would later admit, with unusual honesty, that Chernobyl was the real beginning of the end. Not because of radiation, not because of politics, but because the disaster vaporized the Kremlin's last cash reserves at the exact moment oil prices were collapsing, the very revenue stream that kept the Soviet machine alive. Behind closed doors, the Politburo ran numbers that made even seasoned bureaucrats pale. The Red Army budget had to be cannibalized. Infrastructure plans vanished. Food subsidies shrank. And still, somehow, the bills kept multiplying, as if every ruble spent on containment sank straight into the ground with the melted reactor core. The most dangerous part, though, wasn't the spending. It was the response. To cover the shortfall, the Soviet Union began printing money. Not legally, not publicly, quietly, desperately, as if the presses themselves were another reactor running hot. Every new batch of rubles increased inflation. Every price increase pushed citizens closer to unrest. Every panic-buying wave exposed the shrinking legitimacy of the state. Hyperinflation wasn't an accident. It was the second explosion, the silent one, triggered by the first. And in this swirl of economic chaos, something else started to break: trust. The one commodity even a superpower cannot survive without. Chernobyl didn't just contaminate land. It contaminated confidence. And confidence, in any monetary system, is oxygen. Once it burns out, collapse is a matter of time. The first thing the world saw was a glow, a soft blue shimmer rising over Reactor 4, as if the night sky itself had been torn open. The second thing they saw was denial. Soviet officials whispered that it was contained, manageable, a local event. But nothing about Chernobyl was local, and nothing about it was manageable. If you're watching this, subscribe, because what you about to hear is the version of Chernobyl that was buried under propaganda and bankruptcy filings. For decades, we were taught the story in pieces: radiation, evacuation, the exclusion zone swallowed by forests and time. But the real story, the one the Kremlin feared most, wasn't radioactive. It was financial. It was a bill so large, so sudden, and so impossible to pay that it cracked the foundation of a superpower already standing on borrowed rubles. Imagine an empire already drowning in falling oil prices, shrinking revenues, and runaway military spending. Then imagine waking up to a disaster so expensive it could drain an entire year's budget in a single flash of light. That was the morning of April 26, 1986, the day the Soviet Union quietly went insolvent. Before Chernobyl, Moscow's economic problems were real, but survivable. The ruble was weakening. Productivity was stagnant. The state was juggling too many promises and too few resources. But nothing, not even the Afghan war, not even the global oil crash, compared to the financial black hole that opened when Reactor 4 exploded. It wasn't just an engineering failure. It was the detonation of the Soviet balance sheet. The numbers alone tell a story of panic. $18 billion in a currency system where billion was a word used only in whispered party meetings. A cleanup operation so huge it consumed the budgets of multiple ministries. A sarcophagus built in record time, swallowing raw materials and manpower that the economy simply did not have. 300,000 people relocated, which meant 300,000 workers removed from the Soviet labor force overnight. And while the rest of the world measured the fallout in sieverts, Moscow measured it in deficits. Gorbachev would later admit, with unusual honesty, that Chernobyl was the real beginning of the end. Not because of radiation, not because of politics, but because the disaster vaporized the Kremlin's last cash reserves at the exact moment oil prices were collapsing, the very revenue stream that kept the Soviet machine alive. Behind closed doors, the Politburo ran numbers that made even seasoned bureaucrats pale. The Red Army budget had to be cannibalized. Infrastructure plans vanished. Food subsidies shrank. And still, somehow, the bills kept multiplying, as if every ruble spent on containment sank straight into the ground with the melted reactor core. The most dangerous part, though, wasn't the spending. It was the response. To cover the shortfall, the Soviet Union began printing money. Not legally, not publicly, quietly, desperately, as if the presses themselves were another reactor running hot. Every new batch of rubles increased inflation. Every price increase pushed citizens closer to unrest. Every panic-buying wave exposed the shrinking legitimacy of the state. Hyperinflation wasn't an accident. It was the second explosion, the silent one, triggered by the first. And in this swirl of economic chaos, something else started to break: trust. The one commodity even a superpower cannot survive without. Chernobyl didn't just contaminate land. It contaminated confidence. And confidence, in any monetary system, is oxygen. Once it burns out, collapse is a matter of time. The strange thing about Chernobyl is that nobody inside the Soviet system understood its economic consequences in real time. They understood the radiation, the fires, the evacuations, but not the ledger, not the numbers, not the slow, invisible drain that would hollow out an already crumbling empire. On paper, the Soviet Union was still a superpower in 1986. It had the world's largest army, a vast nuclear arsenal, and an industrial base spread across 15 republics. But beneath that image was a system built on credit that no one called credit. It was built on extraction, from oil, from gas, from agriculture, from satellite states, and the money flowing in from those exports kept the illusion alive. When oil prices collapsed in late 1985, the Soviet budget imploded overnight. Moscow lost more than half its hard currency revenue. It was like a heart that suddenly stopped pumping. Then Chernobyl exploded, and the bill arrived. Every Soviet ministry that had been operating on fumes suddenly became responsible for part of the cleanup. The Defense Ministry lost billions as military units were reassigned from traditional duties to radiological containment. The Agriculture Ministry lost millions of acres of farmland, obliterating planned harvests that were supposed to feed the Eastern republics. The Health Ministry wasn't just caring for burn victims. They were spending money they didn't have on monitoring, evacuations, and treatments that weren't even documented yet. And worst of all, no one could admit any of this publicly. To the Politburo, economic weakness was a national security threat. Transparency was unthinkable. So Chernobyl became an unbudgeted secret, a giant financial crater buried beneath propaganda, optimism, and denial. Costs were absorbed quietly through reallocations, which was a polite way of saying, we recutting everything else to pay for a hole in the earth. Factories that were already unprofitable were told to meet impossible quotas with fewer workers. Military research programs were delayed or canceled entirely. Infrastructure outside Moscow aged into dysfunction. The empire was quietly eating itself alive, 1 ruble at a time. And yet, to the average Soviet citizen, the crisis still hadn't shown itself. Their wages still arrived. Their ration cards still worked. Their newspapers still promised a bright socialist future. What no one saw was the widening gap between what the state promised and what the state could afford. That gap, after Chernobyl, became a canyon. Gorbachev found himself performing economic triage in a dark room. Every reform he attempted, price restructuring, limited privatization, currency stabilization, was swallowed by the financial gravity of Chernobyl. The reactor didn't just melt down, it melted the foundation of the entire Soviet budget. And the liquidity crisis that followed forced Moscow into its most dangerous financial maneuver, printing money without productive output behind it. Hyperinflation didn't arrive overnight. It crept through the system like radiation, invisible, silent, and irreversible. And as the numbers began to unravel, something else began to unravel with them. The psychological contract that held the USSR together. The strange thing about the months after the explosion is how quickly the scale of the catastrophe began to metastasize, not because of radiation, but because of budgets. Every ministry in the Soviet administrative labyrinth felt the tremor. Agriculture begged for emergency funding as millions of hectares became permanently contaminated. The Ministry of Health demanded unprecedented allocations for mass screenings, burn units, and temporary wards. Transportation ministries needed trains, buses, and fuel for forced evacuations. Housing authorities scrambled to build entire towns overnight for the displaced. Concrete cities rising in bleak uniformity, financed entirely by debt that no one bothered to record publicly. The appearance of control mattered more than the cost of control. At the Politburo table, the tone shifted from confident to brittle. Officials who once spoke in rehearsed certainty began using phrases like temporary allocation, extraordinary expenditure, and the verbal poison no economist wants to hear, unplanned issuance. Behind those euphemisms hid one unavoidable truth. The Soviet Union was beginning to print its way into insolvency. Gorbachev saw it happening in real time. Every week, cleanup estimates escalated. Every week, revenues fell. The Soviet budget had been nourished for decades by oil, gas, and commodity exports. But 1986 was the worst possible year for a nuclear meltdown. Crude prices had cratered from above $30 to below $10, evaporating the hard currency earnings Moscow depended on. For an economy already strained by Afghanistan, an arms race, and endemic inefficiency, the crash was catastrophic. Then came the soldiers. The Red Army had always consumed the lion's share of the Soviet budget, but now its money was being siphoned away to fund evacuation logistics, helicopter brigades for aerial operations, radiation units, medical battalions, and equipment replacement after vehicles became radioactive waste. Trucks, tanks, and armored transports were discarded like used gloves. Thousands of machines had to be buried in trenches because they were too radioactive to reuse. These were not just assets, they were capital that had to be replaced with money the Soviet Union no longer had. Chernobyl wasn't just a reactor explosion. It was a budgetary black hole. What made the situation even more corrosive was the psychological cost. In command economies, legitimacy depends on the illusion of omnipotence, that the state can fix anything, mobilize anyone, solve every crisis. But the leaks from Pripyat, the secrecy, the denials, and the panic destroyed that aura. Citizens saw the cracks. Factory workers whispered that the party wasn't telling the truth. Scientists understood that their leadership didn't understand the physics it claimed to control. Families feared invisible particles more than foreign armies. Trust, already fragile, evaporated. Within ministries, that distrust turned inward. Bureau chiefs guarded data like weapons. Regional officials falsified reports to protect their reputations. Economists stopped believing official inflation numbers. Even within Gosplan, the central planning agency, quiet skepticism spread like radiation dust. When the planners no longer believe in the plan collapses long before the country does. Gorbachev needed reforms. He needed capital. He needed breathing room. Chernobyl gave him none. Instead, the reactor forced him into a fiscal trap. Fund the cleanup or watch public faith collapse. Fund the military or watch geopolitical leverage collapse. Fund consumer needs or watch the streets erupt. Every choice was lose-lose, and all three demanded money that no longer existed. The Soviet Union had entered what economists call a negative-sum equilibrium. every decision made the situation worse. And then there were the relocation zones. 300,000 citizens uprooted from their homes. Engineers, farmers, teachers, technicians, entire microeconomies wiped off the map. The Soviet Union didn't just lose people, it lost productive capacity. Every worker displaced had to be fed, housed, and supported. Every factory abandoned had to be replaced somewhere else. Every hectare of poisoned farmland had to be compensated for with imported grain bought in hard currency. Currency the USSR couldn't earn because oil revenues had collapsed. Chernobyl didn't merely contaminate land. It contaminated the balance sheet of a superpower. And beneath the administrative chaos, a quieter transformation was taking place. Economists across Eastern Europe began privately circulating papers showing that Soviet money supply growth had detached from output growth. The ruble was becoming a confidence currency, valuable only as long as people believed the state remained unshakable. But belief was fading. By 1987, the Kremlin was funding multiple crises simultaneously: the Afghan war, collapsing industrial productivity, consumer shortages, and now the most expensive nuclear cleanup in human history. Something had to give, and it did, quietly, invisibly, fatally. The Soviet Union began monetizing everything it couldn't afford. It printed rubles at a pace that officials insisted was temporary, necessary, and controlled. But everyone familiar with monetary history knows a simple rule. Once a government begins printing to cover real losses, it cannot stop without consequences. Chernobyl accelerated that process by years. Factories that had once valued state wages began refusing to accept rubles as payment, preferring commodities, foreign currency, or barter. Regions began hoarding supplies. Cooperatives pushed unofficial pricing. The ruble still existed, but its authority was slipping. A currency collapses long before its notes lose color. Collapse begins when belief becomes optional. And Chernobyl made belief optional. This was not yet the climax, but the drift toward it had begun, a slow-motion fall disguised as stability. The Soviet economy was no longer cracking. It was quietly unraveling, thread by thread, beneath the weight of an explosion that no one could afford to pay for. The turning point arrives quietly, not with the roar of an explosion, but with the shuffling of papers inside a Soviet ministry building. A single budget sheet, columns of impossible numbers, deficits that could no longer be hidden, circulates among senior officials. Each man reads it twice, then a third time, hoping the arithmetic will magically change. It doesn't. The truth is finally undeniable. The Soviet Union is bankrupt, not because of military overextension, not because of ideology, but because a reactor in northern Ukraine detonated a black hole in the nation's finances. The climax of this entire story is brutal in its simplicity. Gorbachev realizes the state cannot pay for both Chernobyl and the Soviet Union at the same time. Something must die, and the reactor's meltdown is already irreversible. The Kremlin begins quietly shutting down the foundations of the empire to keep the illusion of solvency alive. Defense budgets shrink. Agricultural support evaporates. Energy subsidies disappear. Whole industries are told to survive without state aid even though they have never operated under market conditions. Factories once producing for the military now sit abandoned because the cash that once funded them is buried under a concrete sarcophagus in Pripyat. Every ruble poured into containing radiation is a ruble taken from feeding the public. Every relocation order is another village erased, another tax base gone, another fiscal wound reopening. Foreign lenders, already skeptical, begin demanding guarantees the Soviets cannot provide. Eastern European satellite nations, sensing weakness, start drifting away economically. Western analysts who once described the USSR as a formidable superpower now privately whisper that the collapse has already begun. It simply hasn't been announced yet. And on the streets of Moscow, inflation begins its quiet creep. Prices adjust weekly, then daily, then hourly. The Soviet citizen, who once believed the system was unshakable, now sees cracks forming in real time. By the time Gorbachev stands before the Politburo and speaks the unspeakable, that the financial consequences of Chernobyl are swallowing the nation whole, the collapse is already in motion. The reactor explosion didn't just ruin a region, it dissolved the economic myth that held a superpower together. The Soviet Union, for all its ideology and its armies, could not survive a nuclear bill that the books simply could not balance. And when the Union finally dissolves in 1991, the world sees it as political, ideological, historical. Few understand the financial autopsy. Few realize the Soviet Union died in 1986, the moment the graphite blocks burned and the numbers stopped working. This disaster was not just radioactive, it was fiscal. It irradiated the balance sheet of a superpower until nothing coherent remained, until the only thing left standing was the truth. No nation, no ideology, no empire can outrun a financial black hole. So as you look at modern crises, environmental, economic, geopolitical, remember this story. Sometimes collapse comes not from invasion or revolution, but from a single event that forces a state to spend money it does not have, on a scale it cannot admit, at a speed it cannot manage. Sometimes nations don't fall, they simply run out of time and credit. If you found this eye-opening, subscribe for more deep-dive financial documentaries that expose the hidden mechanics shaping our world.